Morning is from Matthew chapter 10, verses 24 through 39. Should be on the screen. Disciples aren't greater than their teacher, and slaves aren't greater than their master. It's enough for disciples to be like their teacher and slaves like their master. If they have called the head of the house Beelzebul, it's certain that they will call the members of his household by even worse names. Therefore, don't be afraid of those people, because nothing is hidden that won't be revealed, and nothing secret that won't be brought out into the open. What I say to you in the darkness, tell in the light. And what you hear whispered, announce from the rooftops. Don't be afraid of those who kill the body, but can't kill the soul. Instead, be afraid of the one who can destroy both body and soul in hell. Aren't 2 sparrows sold for a small coin? But not one of them will fall to the ground without your Father knowing about it already. Even the hairs of your head are all counted. Don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. Therefore, anyone who acknowledges me before people, I will also acknowledge before my Father who is in heaven. But anyone who denies me before people, I will also deny before my Father who is in heaven. Don't think that I've come to bring peace to the earth. I haven't come to bring peace, but a sword. I've come to turn a man against his father, a daughter against her mother, and a daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law. People's enemies are members of their own households. Those who love father or mother more than me aren't worthy of me. Those who love son or daughter more than me aren't worthy of me. Those who don't pick up their crosses and follow me aren't worthy of me. Those who find their lives will lose them, and those who lose their lives because of me will find them. This is the gospel of Jesus Christ. I was reminded during annual conference that the mission statement of the United Methodist Church is making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. And I thought, because disciples are mentioned here, and you might have guessed because teachers are something I was going to talk about, that I'm going to talk about disciples. What is a disciple? I think for a long time in my life, probably even up to the time I went to seminary, I thought of a disciple as someone who was a follower of Jesus. And they had pledged to follow him wherever he went. And that's how you would know them. You would know them because when you saw Jesus, they would be there. As an apostle, some of them were sent out on mission trips to do things, to carry out the mission of the church or the mission of Jesus. An apostle was different than a disciple because they had been sent. The passage we heard starts with the statement that a disciple isn't greater than the master. And I've been inspired by Mark to look stuff up and find it in original language. I'm going to have trouble with this. The Greek word that's translated disciple is mathetes. And it means a pupil, a learner. When I talk to the young people here about being learners who have teachers, it was built on this idea of disciple. A disciple was a learner. There is a follower, and it has a whole separate word, akoluteo. That's a follower. That's one that follows. That's my dog. When I go somewhere, my dog wants to go along. My dog's a follower. Akoluteo. Now, some of you who've been around when I've preached in the past, because, you know, the lectionary goes for 3 years, and every 3 years it repeats. And before I went into ministry, I was a lay speaker, and I would get called upon to come and preach during annual conference. Always falls around this time of year. And since I have been retired, I have preached on this passage, Matthew 10, 24 through 39, at least 4 times. I have notes for 4 times I've preached on this. 2 of them have been here. So this may be old news to some of you, but when Jesus talked to disciples, it was like the process of an internship, an apprenticeship. Like an apprentice apprentices himself to a journeyman whatever, and learns that trade. And when he is sufficiently trained and knows all the things that he or she needs to know, then he can become a journeyman. Sorry. Maybe journeywoman, but I have never heard that term. But they become trained and able to teach others the skills of that trade. So a disciple is like someone who's apprenticed to learn how to be whatever. And in this case, it's called to be learned about, called to learn about what it's like to be Jesus. Okay? And the learning process is that we become like him in the things that we do, the things that we say, and the things that we teach. And hopefully that works out so that we become faithful teachers of what it's like to be Jesus. So I thought this week, what should we be learning? And I asked the question of the people at Pub Theology this week. And they told me some of the things that we should be learning to be around Jesus. I'm not going to go through all of the things that they said, but I agreed with many of them. Matter of fact, I think I agreed with all of them. Jesus lived in an interesting time. It was not unlike our own. He lived in a segmented society. There were priests who were concerned about continuance of their faith. Okay? There were Roman soldiers who were interested, whose job it was to keep peace in the Middle East at this time. And Jesus called to him people from a mix of folk, fishermen, more fishermen than anything else, fishers. He called tax collectors like Bill. He called a person who was interested in overthrowing the Roman government that was a part of the world around him. He called a twin, a twin. He called to himself a motley, he called a traitor to be a part of his followers. He had a motley crew. And he interacted with all of them, and it affected the way he saw the world around him, I'm sure. Or maybe they were a reflection of the way he saw the world around them. Rome was in firm control, and the people resented it. So there were active resistors to Roman rule. And they were a part of the community. They were people who had to pay taxes to Rome, and they resented it. We don't know people like that. There were Gentiles in the city, people who were non-believers in the Jewish faith, who were there for business or to visit friends or whatever. There were Samaritans in the area. They were people who were genetically related to Jews, but they believed differently. They didn't believe that God lived on Mount Zion. They believed that God lived on Mount Gerizim. And as often happens when you have a belief system like that, you become firm in that, and you think everybody else has to be wrong. And you stand up against their policies and beliefs. And that was a factor in Jesus' time. Jesus moved through this diverse society, and he interacted with them. I mean, we know, I talked about Samaritans just now, we know he interacted with Samaritans. There's a story in the Bible about where he sees this Samaritan woman drawing water from a well. And he offers her living water, even though her belief system is different. And she doesn't disavow that when Jesus talks to her about it. Well, we know you think God worships on or lives on Mount Zion, but we know he lives on Mount Gerizim, and still he offers her living water. And she becomes the first, well, not the first, but she becomes an evangelizer there to her community of Samaritans. And she goes back into the city and she says, "Come and see this man who knows everything I ever did." A couple of weeks ago, Mark told us the story of Matthew, the tax collector, who is resented by people because his job is to fund the Roman government that they hate. And Jesus calls him to be one of his 12 followers. one of his 12 disciples, one of his persons he wants to know about him and his beliefs and his life. When they asked Jesus about why he would call a tax collector to be one of his immediate crowd, Jesus said, well people don't need a doctor. It's sick people who do. Jesus relates to the outcasts of society. That's one of the things I've learned about Jesus. The people Jesus picked to relate to intimately, to relate to as they sat around dining around the fire at night after the crowds had left, were people from a mixed lot: fisherman, tax collector, a rebel against Roman rule, a thief, a traitor. He responded to a variety of people. I remember one of the stories in John's Gospel about a woman who's caught in the very act of adultery. And as Jesus comes across her, she's surrounded by a circle of men who have decided it's their job to enforce the Jewish law that anyone who is an adulteress should be stoned to death. And they address Jesus and tell him about their grievances, about why they are there and why they have their stones in their hand ready to cast them. And Jesus kneels down in the dust and he scratches in the dirt. I always say that's a sign that he knows how to read and write. And suddenly they drop their stones and they wander away. And Jesus says to her, I want you to go and be a better person. Scripture records it, go and sin no more. But I think that's really an unrealistic expectation. But he doesn't want her to fall into her prior behavior patterns. He wants her to become a different person than what she was before. Compassion for others who are in tough places in their lives. That's one of the things I've learned about Jesus. There's a story in the Bible about a man who is born blind. And he sits outside the city gates and begs. And as he hears that Jesus is going to pass by his gate, he calls out to Jesus, Jesus, come and heal me. And Jesus kneels down beside him, scoops up some dust from the ground, the stuff from which we're made, and he spits into it, and he mixes it together, and he puts it on the man's eyes. And he can see. This man who has been born blind now can see. And the priests and the Jewish nobles are irate because it is a Sabbath day and Jesus has worked on the Sabbath. He spread that stuff. He mixed that stuff. He has violated the law of the Sabbath. And he tells a story about a farmer who loses his donkey in the well. And he asks the religious people, is it right to get that donkey out of the well? Well, we suppose so. And he says, this person has needs. He didn't say that in that term. But his message is, this person had needs. And those needs needed to be dealt with. And the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. Sometimes, you have to be careful with this, but sometimes people are more important than the rules. And when someone has a need, then maybe to satisfy that, you need to break the rules. By the way, the crowds have to have a theological discussion. Then they began talking about what caused this man's blindness. Who sinned? Was it his parents? Was it him? Well, he was born blind, so probably wasn't him because he wasn't alive to be a bad person before he went blind. But, you know, sometimes bad things happen to good people. Not through their fault or through the fault of somebody else, but sometimes bad things happen to good people. There was a young man in a community that was part of my parish at one point, not here. And one day he'd been at a place his mother worked up on the hill, and he was coming home on his bicycle. And he was coming down the hill like many of us do when you're coming down a hill and you're on a bicycle and it begins to roll, and there's that exhilarating feeling of having the wind rush by you and the road is going by. There was a car coming up the hill. We had discussions in my congregation about who had sinned. Was it this young man who was coming down the hill at a speed that he was not really in control? Was it the car going up who had not been exactly in the lane because there were curves? Sometimes bad things happen to good people, and it's not really meaningful to try to figure out who's at fault. Jesus collected all of these people to him, and he related to them as people, not as by where they were in society, not whether they were fishermen or tax collectors or rebels. They were people, and as people, they were more important. I think that's why we have potlucks, why potlucks are so important in the life of the church. It's an informal event that we can come and see each other as people, not as fellow worshipers or not as pastors or, somebody always came up to me when I was at a potluck and said, don't hold my language against me. Togetherness is important in life. And Jesus' relationship to the 12 while symbolic, was more than that. It had to do with how we live society, and there's a time in society when it's good to be together. There's time in society when it's good to be together formally. There's times in society where it's good to be together informally. Breaking bread together is an important act of sacredness. Togetherness is important in life. That's one of the things I've learned from Jesus. Jesus would go off by himself in prayer and reflection. Things would pile up on him. And you would see that he's gone out somewhere away from the crowd to pray and to reflect on the things that are a part of his life. Time with God is important. That's one of the things I learned from Jesus. And there's a balance. There's time alone with God, and there's time to reach out there's time for both. And a balanced life needs time for both. And that's one of the things I've learned from Jesus. There's a story, this story puzzles me. I think it reflects the human side of Jesus. The Gospel of Mark has this story at the end of Holy Week. Matthew and Luke have it at the beginning of Holy Week. Jesus has had a tough day. He has been driving money changers out of the temple. They're there. Money changers have an important part in the faith because you can't carry a graven image into the temple. Okay, so if you look at a quarter, there's a graven image on there. In our money, it's George Washington. In Jewish times, it would have been the emperor. And to carry that into the temple would be grievous. But the money changers have set up a business, and a business is different from a nonprofit in that its purpose is to get money. And so they've set up their business in the temple. And they will sell you a chicken for $1. They will sell you a chickadee for $0.25. No, $0.75, because there has to be a profit. Anyway, Jesus has been there, and he's dismayed by what he sees, and he goes into the temple and he overturns the tables, and he drives the money changers out of the temple with a whip made out of cords that he finds there in the temple. And then in Mark's gospel, he's heading out back to where he's staying, and he sees a fig tree, and he thinks, hey, a good fig would be good right now. But it's not fig season. And Jesus curses that fig tree for nothing that it did wrong, except that it had to be on this day that he's been having such a tough time. It doesn't say that. Before I went into ministry, I used to ask every pastor I ever had, tell me about this story in which Jesus curses the fig tree because it doesn't have figs and it's not fig season. It just seems totally unlike Jesus to me. It just seems like it's not fair to the fig tree to give it a curse for being what it is, a fig tree out of season. And most of my pastors referred me to Matthew and Luke, where that occurs at the beginning. Oh, by the way, Matthew and Luke leave out the fig tree. It's somewhere else. But Mark attaches it to this story, and I wonder to myself, why did Mark do that? And I decided because he's trying to illustrate that sometimes as human beings, we do stupid things. We do unfair things. It's part of being human. I don't want to tell you that's what I learned from Jesus. But I appreciate that story for that very reason. I don't want to leave out something. There's a story where Jesus is out in the wilderness, maybe not unlike the picture on the screen. Yeah. And the disciples, they're very zealous. They want to make sure that Jesus uses his time effectively. And so there are some children that come into the circle and they say, we're trying to protect you so that your time is able to be spent with the adults, right? And Jesus says, let the children come, because the kingdom of God is made up of people like that. That's what I learned from Jesus. And one of the things I've learned is that the worth of the whole surpasses the worth of the individual. What we hear about Jesus is that he's crucified and dies on the cross for us. Substitutionary atonement, that's called. And the reason that's meaningful for us is because we're a part of that whole that Jesus died for, because he knew that his life as an individual part of society was not as important as the whole of society. And I think we've missed that lesson a lot. Well, I don't have to do such and such because I have freedom. I don't have to do such and such because I want to do something else. I don't waste my time in church. You see, we're putting more value on what we believe, what we think, what our value is, more than all of society around us. We're not interested in the welfare of society. And I think what I learned from Jesus is that the whole is more important than any individual part of it. We are more important than I. And that's what I learned from Jesus. I hope somewhere in this rambling, you've heard something that made sense to you and how you are. This is a hint to Bill that he needs to get up here so we can do the hymn. That you've heard something in here that has been meaningful to you, that maybe has caused you to think about what you've learned from Jesus. By the way, this last thing Jesus says, blessed are those who lay down their life for others, because, this is my statement of that, we are more important than the individual.